Tainá invited me to be part of this exhibition, and I chose to make this work, which has 3 elements to it. One of them is this video. The other one is the set of printed letters, which you can see on the desk right in front of you. And the third one is a reading of this this essay, which no, can I start again, because that was the first one. Because it has 3 elements, so it's the video of the reading, so there's 2 elements, and this. Okay, let's start again. Okay, I'm going to start by talking a little bit about what I'm going to do, and I'm going to read an essay which is by Vilém Flusser. Vilém Flusser is the philosopher that I study. I have been studying Vilém Flusser for quite a few years now. I'm doing a PhD about Vilém Flusser. So when Tainá invited me to be part of this exhibition, I chose an essay which he wrote that is called On Typography. And I chose this essay for different reasons, because it was all a kind of coincidence, because over the last few months I've been developing a project which is a publishing house, and I've started publishing some of the translations that I am doing of Flusser's work. And in the process of working on the publishing house, on starting the design for the books and thinking about the whole typographic identity of these books, I reread this essay by Flusser, which is coincidentally called On Typography. And I had forgotten that I had already read this essay many years ago, and I had forgotten exactly what it was about, and I decided to read it to see if it would give me some ideas and suggestions of how to work with typography. The way that Flusser works, he has a very specific style of writing, in that his style is it's essayistic, it's very literary. It is not, the essays are not written in an academic style, so they are not, let's say, scientific in inverted commas, in the classic sense that we think of science is done. But they are very image orientated. So in this essay, he uses the image, he uses the idea of typography in order to talk about something else, in order to project concepts onto the work, onto the concept of typography. And I'm going to read it in the same style that I've always read in my seminars. There will be some breaks and some comments on top of the reading, and also to help to make references to what I have been doing and so on. But one thing that I think is important to say also is that I started translating Flusser's work from Portuguese to English about 5 years ago. It was exactly 5 years ago, actually. It was in 2010. And Flusser, one thing that progressively became very apparent to me is Flusser's use of the graphic layout of the text on the page in order to create a rhythm of the text and in order to create meaning within a phrase. This has many different reasons, but one of one of the main reasons is because in the 60s, when Flusser started writing and publishing in a newspaper in Brazil, he was also friends with many of Brazil's concrete poets. Augusto de Campos was one of them, Haroldo de Campos also, but one of his greatest friends at that time was Dora Ferreira da Silva, who was a poet, but who was also the wife of Vicente Ferreira da Silva, who was a Brazilian philosopher, who unfortunately died quite young in 1964. And it's quite interesting from a kind of typographic, or I think it's better to say a sort of design perspective, when reading or when looking at Flusser's early typed manuscripts, because he always typed, he never wrote anything in long form by hand. The very first manuscripts or typescripts from 1961 or even the late 50s, they are always very well behaved. They have perfect paragraphs, and the punctuation is all correct, and things are laid out in a very formal sense. But then as the 60s progresses, visually, like on the page, his work starts to change. It's a different elements start coming into the work, and it starts getting a little bit wilder. But also the biggest change is in the punctuation, is how he uses very specific punctuation marks like the colon, the semicolon, dashes. When I started translating his work, it became very apparent to me that these are very specifically chosen visual aids in order to create a very specific rhythm in the text, because he wrote the texts, all of his texts, especially in the early 60s, they were written in order to be read to an audience. He was teaching in different places, so he would read the essays out loud, and therefore the style of the text on the page had to give him the cues of how to read and how to intonate the text. And so his relationship with the letter on the page was a very material relationship, very visual relationship. And whenever I translate his work, I work very hard to keep this, not to take this away, not to take these kind of odd elements away, which is what gives the text its nature, like one of the elements. And it's always very difficult with editors, especially with copy editors, because they want always to standardize the text into what they have in their mind is standard English, or this concept of a standard language. But what I have discovered over the years from translating texts and translating other people's texts as well is that there's nothing that we could call standard language. When I started translating Flusser's work, this all became very apparent to me, this visual aspect of Flusser's work. And so when I started a few months ago creating the books for this publishing house, which is called Metaflux, I was already very sensitive to this, the visual nature of text on the page. And so I started reading, after I reread this essay by Flusser on typography, I started reading books on the history of typography, on the history of type design, of how letters achieve the shapes that they have today. And it's actually a really fascinating history, especially because most of what we know about typography, or most of the terminology that we use with typography today, it still relates to a very specific period of about 150 years, from 1450 to 1600, until in 1600 everything that is related to typography and to the printing industry started becoming standardized. Things became a standard. But in this 150 years, it was very fluid. The shapes of the letters, the size of the letters, and one thing that is interesting in the history of typography, of reading the history of typography, is that today when we think of typographic design, we always think of a designer. There are famous designers today that, of the 20th century, of the 19th century, that created the shapes of the letters that we know. And but in the very beginning, when Gutenberg started printing, there was no such thing as a designer of letters, a designer of type, and the shape of the letters were defined by the people who cut the metal shapes, which were called punches, that would make the molds from which type was cast in a mixture of lead and other metals. But there was no fixed standard. So this progression between calligraphy, which was handwriting before the invention of the press, the printing press, to type, to letters with a fixed shape, happened right at the beginning of the Renaissance, and it happened right at the moment when so many of our standards were set, they were created. And this is what Flusser is talking about in this essay, which is quite remarkable, because sometimes he's accused of not being kind of technically knowledgeable about the things that he's talking about. But in this case, it sounds like he knew exactly what he was talking about. He must have read about this history. So what I'll do is I'll just start reading and I'll make comments along the way. Do we need to break before we start, or can I just start reading? Yeah?
We can start.
Okay. All right. So this essay is called On Typography, and I think that it was written, it doesn't have a date on it, it was never published. It's found in the I found it in the Vilém Flusser archive. But by the disposition of the letters, and also by the typewriter that he's using and how he's laying out the page, and also by what he's talking about in the essay, I can say that it's from the 80s. This letter is from the mid 80s to late 80s, anywhere between 85 and 1990. Flusser, by the way, died in 1991, so this whole production is very recent. So, on typography. This paper will consider the present transition from the Gutenberg culture toward an electromagnetic one from the point of view of typing. It will suggest that the gesture of typing articulates a specific way of thinking, a specific mentality which we are about to abandon. And it will try to glance into the future to see what sort of mentality may be expected to supplant the one expressed in typing. This is not so much the technique of typing, it is the worldview which underlies typing that shall be put in question. When he says Gutenberg culture, we can also refer to this in media studies. This is also referred to as typographic thinking. Marshall McLuhan, for example, talks about a typographic man. in his book, The Gutenberg Galaxy. And when he uses the word type, we have also to think, and typing in this sense here, he's using typing not only as a verb, to type on a typewriter, but typing as in setting a type, setting a standard, setting a model, setting a measure, something to be, to relate to. And the word type that comes from Greek also is part of words such as archetype, prototype, stereotype. So this triad is very important conceptually, because in thinking, for example, the concept of a prototype is also the concept of a model. Is the concept of something that sets a standard against which everything else is either measured or copied from. So a stereotype is then a copy of a prototype, and this will become a little bit clearer as he explains it later. But so, continuing, the printing press was not really an invention. Almost all the techniques which it employs were well known long before the 15th century. The press was used to manufacture olive oil. Negative forms were cast in metal for hundreds of years. The manufacture of paper had been invented centuries before, and ink was in use ever since the Egyptians. What the printing press really meant was the discovery that letters of the alphabet are not characters, but types. This was a discovery which was to change the very structure of Western civilization. What we call the modern age was born, namely that age which manipulates types in order to understand and to dominate the world, the age of science. So here in this paragraph, there's quite a lot, but one thing, if we change the word type to the word model and reread this sentence, we can say, namely, that age which manipulates models in order to understand and to dominate the world. We can also change it again to standards, namely that age which manipulates standards in order to understand and dominate the world, or namely that age that manipulates measurements in order to understand and to dominate the world. And this, from an epistemological perspective, it's a very big change, it's a very big shift, and it has to do with the way that the philosophy has developed over the last 2,000 years, which he will go into later as well. But another point in this paragraph, which is interesting, is when he says that that almost all the techniques which it employs, as in the printing press, were well known before the 15th century. So basically what he's saying, and which I think is very true, is that whenever we create a new technology, or whenever we think we've discovered something, in fact that is, if we analyze it carefully, we see that it is a confluence of many other things that have come together to create this new thing. The computer didn't come out of nowhere. It wasn't a creation. It was a series of many different techniques and technologies that came together to become this thing that we call a computer, and so on and so forth. So because when we look back at the past and we say, we use the reference of the printing press as the moment when the printing press was invented, that changed everything. But we have to remember that there was a very long lead up to that point. It wasn't something that happened out of the blue, and there was a very specific need at that moment for creating such a thing as the printing press. There was a greater need for printed text, and the scribes couldn't copy the texts fast enough. But also the hand-copied books were far too expensive for most people. So there was a very, very specific economic and social need at that time for creating something like the printing press. But it took about 150 years for it to become an industry, for it to really become an industry. In the beginning, it was very much craft orientated, and the people who were creating the shapes of the letters, the punch cutters, they were goldsmiths basically, who were freelancers at that time, and were not like contracted by someone in order to create the letters. But some of them became famous because of the specific letters that they created, sets of letters or types. The inventors of the alphabet were not conscious of what they had invented. They took the letters to be signs for sounds which are characteristic of a specific spoken language. Thus, they believed that every language required an alphabet of its own. In the Middle Ages, 4 such alphabets were in use: the Greek, the Arabic, the Hebrew, and the Latin ones. Of course, medieval writers knew that alphabets may be adapted to languages which they were not originally meant to render visible. They used the Latin alphabet to write down vulgar languages, and the Arabic one to write down Iranian languages, to quote a few examples. Still, they felt that there was something illegitimate in this abuse of letters. The sacred character of the letters suffered from this vulgarization. Gutenberg, by handling the letters as if they were three-dimensional objects, as if they were realities and not symbols, showed the relative independence of letters from the sounds of a specific spoken language. He showed that the letters do not represent sounds, but that they typify them. And this is important, that they typify the sound. So they create the standard of the sound, the standard against which the sound is measured. That it is possible within limits to use any alphabet for any spoken language. For instance, to use the Latin alphabet to write down Mandarin or Swahili within limits. The printing press showed that alphabetic writing is not a gesture which captures the sounds of a specific language, but that it is a gesture which abstracts the specificity of that language in order to discover what is typical about it. That writing is a gesture of abstraction and typification. Gutenberg discovered that the inventors of the alphabet had unconsciously invented abstract and typifying thinking. And this is a very interesting play that he does with the word type and typifying. So, like as I was saying before, typing he's playing with what we know the word typing means, or what we think it means, like typing on a typewriter. But in using the term typifying thinking, it's a thinking that creates models, a thinking that doesn't necessarily only contemplate models. And this is to do with how Western epistemology has always approached the question of the contemplation of models, or what is knowledge, where does knowledge come from, how do we achieve knowledge, and of course for Plato it was about the contemplation of eternal forms, eternal shapes, from which we created other things which set the standards for us. But what he's saying is that in the Middle Age, in the modern age, we discovered that we are the ones who create these models, who are the ones that create these standards. So let's just continue a little bit. But one thing that he's correct here, also in a technical sense, which is interesting, is when he says that they used the Latin alphabet to write down vulgar languages, and there's a very kind of, in this period of 150 years when printing started, there was a very clear separation about what types of letters were allowed to be used in the printing of, say, sacred texts like the Bible. So the first Bibles, they were printed in Gothic letter, which is called black letter. And there were two types of black letter. There was the rotunda, which is the Italian one with rounded edges, and the quadrata, which is the German one, which has angular edges. And there was an attempt at that stage to there was a Bible that was printed in Latin lettering, which is the one that we know today. Sorry, not Latin, Roman, like Roman type, and there was a very there was a negative reaction to that. So he had to go back to printing the Bible in black letter, and in the beginning. Roman type was used for vulgar languages, Italian, French, Spanish, English, but the Latin texts were printed in black letter for sacred texts and so on and so forth, and so it's interesting that there was this period, and it was only during the Enlightenment, during the kind of after the Renaissance, that Roman type became the standard type, and Gothic became the kind of secondary type of lettering, became old, became known as a kind of past form. So he's very correct about that in that sense. But this notion of handling letters as if they were three-dimensional objects is also very significant, because before printing, before the concept of typographic thinking, there were no particular standards for letters. Calligraphers could create the shapes of the letters. They were in control of the shape of the letters that they created, and how they created the letters, and how they were laid out on a page. They could squeeze the letters, make the letters a little bit fatter in order to fit the right amount of words on a line, etc. But when letters became three-dimensional, all of these things changed, and all of these considerations became of a different nature. And what he's suggesting is that had the very change in the medium had a direct effect on the way that we think through that medium. So every medium, in this sense, already predetermines what we can think and do through it. It's a symbiotic relationship. It's difficult to think today to think in relation to text beyond typography. It's still very difficult. And I think that one thing that is interesting that links to this exhibition was that the concrete poetry that was done, especially in the 60s and 70s in Brazil, and that was done by Augusto de Campos and also Haroldo de Campos, is a type of poetry that is, I think, in my opinion, intrinsically linked to typography. It's a type of poetry that could not exist without typography. And there are many different types of poetry from the East, from China, from Japan, from the Middle East, from Arabic countries, that create visual forms with letters, but through calligraphy. And those are never referred to as concrete poems. They are referred to as painting, as art, or because they are done with brushes and so on. And also because the interesting difference is that in that kind of calligraphic work, the artist is completely in control of the shape of the letters. He bends, he stretches the letters in order to create the shape that he wants, so that he creates the image that he wants. But the concrete poets never change the shape of the letters, which is interesting because it links to what Flusser is saying here. The letters, the typographic letters, they set such a hard standard that you can't really change them that much, or at least the concrete poets never actually change the shape. And it's interesting when I read Augusto de Campos speaking, talking about how he developed or how he created his poems using letter sets and other forms of applying the letters to the paper. He always refers to the letters through their typographic family. And so it means that he has a great respect for the shape of those letters. He understands them. He knows, and he never dares to change the shape of the letters, to bend the letters. He changes the size of the letters. He puts a big one next to a little one, and so on. But he never changes the style of the letter, which I think is a very. This is not a criticism. It's just an interesting observation in terms of how these two approaches relate to the use of letters on the page in order to create images. He did even more than that. He showed the limits of this thinking. Although he did not yet use the Latin letters to print Swahili books, only German ones, he still had to adapt his types to the specificity of the sounds of his language. There is, for instance, no Latin letter to represent the German sound of the SH, the sh sound. So one had to be invented. By the way, the SCH solution is not a very happy invention. The problem involved here is this. Although types are abstractions from the concrete world, and although they lead a sort of independent life of their own, they must be adapted to the concrete world ever so often. What Gutenberg showed was that types must be manipulated if they are to capture what is typical in the concrete world. By doing this, he demonstrated that there are two distinct kinds of manipulation. The one is a handling of concrete objects, and it is called work. The other is a handling of types, of symbols, and it is called information production. In fact, the printing press was a practical demonstration of what writing is, not a gesture of work, but one of information production. That he who writes does not aim at changing the world by handling objects, but by handling symbols. And that he handles the symbols in such a way that they grasp the objects. This demonstration, slow to become fully conscious, had profound consequences. So this is here. It's interesting in this one phrase where he says, the one is a handling of concrete objects and is called work. The other is a handling of types, of symbols, and is called information production. But what he says here, the one is a handling of concrete objects and is called work. This is praxis. This is what the Greeks would term techne, which is the original meaning of the term art. Techne was translated to Latin as art, ars, and So to work would be to literally handle and shape objects, things, forms, to make this table, to make this cup, or like this microphone, or whatever. What he refers to as work is not what we today know as work, as in, 9 to 5 job, going to the office, etc. Work that he's talking about here is the changing of the world around us, the creation of all these things that we have around us. But of course, in order to create all these things, we have to think in terms of shapes. We have to create these shapes. We have to make these shapes from somewhere. And the handling of types, or the handling of models, is what he's saying. Like today, like the discovery of the modern age was that we could then handle types. We could handle models. We could manipulate models in order to create shapes, instead of thinking about shapes in terms of universal, eternal shapes, which were, of course, created by God, because this is kind of Platonic metaphysics. But he's going to explain that now in these next 3 paragraphs. So, for classical and medieval philosophy and theology, types, the forms that underlie the characteristic phenomena and are hidden by them, were eternal, unchangeable ideas, which can only be passively contemplated. So this is classic. This is the classic explanation of how Platonic philosophy worked, which is what gives the beginning, like the start of what then became kind of Western religious thinking. Like God is the eternal, unchangeable form, and we relate everything to God. We were created in the image of God, and so the only thing that we can do is to contemplate these forms and try to discover the essence, these forms as essences in all the forms that we have in the world. So in contemplating our form, we discover God as the essence of this form, etc., etc. They hover in the heavens, and all man can do is theoretically contemplate them. The praxis of handling types as if they were objects, the praxis of the printing press, gave birth to a new attitude towards theory, and the very word changed its meaning. It no longer meant contemplation of forms, and it came to mean deliberate manipulation of forms. And this is a very interesting suggestion, and it's also a kind of a sort of provocation and a kind of interesting point, because the word theory, that comes from Greek, it's from the Greek theoria, was the opposite of techne. So techne is the physical handling of forms. Theoria was the contemplation of these eternal shapes, these eternal forms, eternal standards, models, etc. But then what he's saying here is that with typographic thinking, what came about was the birth of the realization that we could change these shapes, that these shapes were not eternal. So that's why it changes the meaning of what we say by theory. And theoria was originally translated to Latin as contemplatio, which is contemplation, and which now has a religious overtone to it, but which was then updated in the modern age to speculatio, which is speculation. So the Greek notion of theory has two outcomes or two veins in Western thinking. One which is a contemplation, which is religious, and one which is speculation, which is modern philosophy. It no longer meant contemplation of forms, and it came to mean deliberate manipulation of forms. The types, the ideas, were no longer taken to be eternal and unchangeable, but on the contrary, to be plastic and requiring constant adaptation to the concrete world. Thus, a dialectic was established between theory and observation, during which observation changes theory and theory changes observation. And the praxis of the printing press demonstrated that types can be applied to objects, pressed against them. Thus, the dialectics was established between theory and application, technique. So, a dialectic between techne and theory, during which techniques change theories and theories change techniques in a process called progress. Now, this is very interesting. This idea that it's the dialectic between theory and techne, or theoria and techne, or theory and praxis, that creates the sense of progress. We create shapes, we press shapes, we create shapes, we press shapes, and then things change, and things start changing, and then suddenly they start changing very fast. Before it was, the contemplation of eternal shapes. We couldn't do anything. We can't change God. God is eternal, so it's something that we can't do anything about. But then we discovered that, oh no, hold on a minute, we can actually manipulate these shapes, and we can throw them back into the world, and then we can look at them, and then we can go back and change the shape again, and then go back. And then this is kind of what he's talking about. So in short, the praxis of the printing press brought about that sort of mentality from which modern science and technology were born. And this is in essence Flusser's, let's say, media theory, that the medium itself informs the way that we express ourselves through it. It's not a case where I have something to express, doesn't matter what that is, and then I look for a medium through which to express what I want to say. What he's saying is that the very nature of every medium already dictates what I can express through it. Doesn't matter if it's wood, doesn't matter if it's digital video, a pencil, text, and so on and so forth. It's always a symbiotic relationship that can't be separated. However, when we get to the digital environment and how we shape things in the digital environment, it changes a little bit. The essence is still there, but what's happening today in terms of how we deal with the idea and the concept of shapes has significantly changed. But I'll say a little bit more about that later. So, to illustrate the difficulty in achieving that mentality, consider the following. Medieval scholastic philosophy thought that the logical problem posed by comparison touches upon the very root of human existence. What do I do if I compare a chair to a table? Do I discover that both are pieces of furniture, and is this furniture-ness the essence of both chair and table? Or is there no such thing as furniture-ness? And did I invent the word furniture for the sake of convenience in order to compare two completely unique and therefore in reality incomparable objects like chair and table, right? So each of these two alternative answers will have me lead a different life if I choose to follow them. If furniture-ness is indeed the essence of both chair and table, And if to compare between the two is indeed to discover that essence, then two methods are available to pierce through appearances and advance toward what is hidden by them. This is making reference to that, what he said before in terms of classical philosophy, that we have to discover the essence of the thing, and we can only do that by piercing the surface to get to their essence. The first method consists in making comparisons of ever higher order. Having discovered furniture-ness by comparing chair to table, I can discover objectivity by comparing a piece of furniture to a piece of metal, and so forth, until I come up against the highest of all the essences, namely God himself, right? Which is what I was saying before. So the second method consists of extracting the essence from the appearance. Thus, I can advance from base metal, like lead and mercury, towards their essence, which is gold. From there towards the stone of wisdom, which is the philosopher's stone, the fount of eternal youth, and so forth, until I come up against the fifth essence, the quintessence, hidden behind all appearances, namely God himself. So this is him talking about what the meaning of theory used to be, of theory, of this. This is what contemplation was about, was finding this this absolute essence by peeling away these layers from all the phenomena. Thus, if I choose the first answer to the problem of comparisons, I can see God and save my soul through philosophy and theology, through alchemy, and through similar disciplined endeavors. This is the way of life chosen by the realists, by those who believe that essences, universals, types, are realities. Universalia sunt realia. So in this sense, what he's talking about, like types, essence, the essence or types, universals, shapes, models, standards, from this perspective are eternal. They are realities. They're very much real. The realists thought that they were real, and one had to discover these. So, if, however, furniture is nothing but a name which I invent for convenience sake, then I must accept the world I was thrown into at birth as a context of unique, incomparable appearances which hide nothing and therefore have no meaning. My effort to compare one appearance to another is nothing but an attempt to give a meaning to an absurd world, and it is doomed to failure. Philosophy, theology, alchemy, and all similar disciplined endeavors will only result in my getting ever more involved within this net of meaningless appearances, in this valley of tears, in this devil's dragnet. The way to escape from it is by pure faith, sola fide, by turning my back to the world of appearances and by turning toward God in the hope that he will save me. This is the way of life chosen by the nominalists, by those who believe that universals, types, are mere names. Universalia sunt nomina. The new modern mentality, which was brought about by the praxis of the printing press, has in effect ended this medieval quarrel about what the types are, by proposing a third alternative answer. Types are neither realities nor are they mere conventions. This new mentality suggests Types are neither realities nor are they mere conventions, this new mentality suggests, but they are useful abstractions from concrete phenomena, which permit to understand the phenomena and to change them. And they can be manipulated to permit ever better understanding and ever more efficient operations. Thus the invention of typography, which was not really an invention but a discovery, contributed powerfully to the difficult transition from medieval mentality to the modern mentality of scientific and technical approach to the concrete world. And this last phrase is quite nice because it links to what I was saying before of how the shape of letters, the shape of type was defined over that 150 years. And it's precisely this changeover period that makes a break between what then became known as the Enlightenment and the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages still very much in this discussion between the realists and the nominalists as to what was the nature of models, the nature of universals, if they were eternal or not, if they were just simply names, conventions, or if they were real, if they were actual realities that had to be discovered. And this also epistemologically has a link to a difference between Greek philosophy and also Jewish tradition, because in Greek philosophy one has to pierce through the appearance to get to the truth, which is what he was saying before. So truth has to be aimed at. One has to contemplate in order to get to the truth, which is the meaning of the Greek theoria. But in Jewish tradition, truth, or God, in this sense, reveals itself. It's not something that one drives towards in order to try to discover it. It reveals itself to you through time, through observation, through contemplation as well, and so on. And so these are kind of he's by using these different themes, he's hinting at some of the very kind of essential beginnings of what we call Western thinking, and all the different currents of Western thinking in terms of how we relate to this, this thing that we call reality, that we call truth, that we used to call God, and so on. This thing that we call the concrete world or the objective world, as if is reality something which is given, which is out there, and we relate to it, or is it something that we create, that we generate? Are we generating this reality that is around us, or are we living in a given objective reality? And this is another thing. Flusser, he doesn't give us answers. All of these theories, they are provocations. They are meant to make us think about these things, but he's not going to come to a conclusion. He's not going to give us a way to solve these things. So he's creating a polemic. Okay, so I'll just continue. Now, this abstract and typifying way of thinking, which manifests itself whenever we read printed matter or use a typewriter, is no longer adequate to the emerging cultural situation. So now he's kind of leaving the modern age and coming into where we are now, which is the fundamental reason for the substitution of typing by new methods of information production and information distribution, like digitized computer images. When he was writing all of this, it was kind of in the 70s and throughout the 80s. So it was the very beginning of the whole digital environment and so on. So he's playing with a lot of things that were happening at the time that he had access to, and he was very well informed about these developments. But of course, things have changed a lot since then. So there are some things which he couldn't have predicted. So to understand why the modern mentality is becoming obsolete, it is useful to consider the premise it stands on. The Greek term typos means trace. The imprint of a bird's foot on a beach is a typos. He who observes that imprint may conclude what sort of bird had caused it. It is typical of that bird. The Greek term graphine means to engrave or to imprint, and it means to write only much later. In effect, it means to do deliberately what the bird on the beach does spontaneously, to leave traces which permit an observer to conclude what caused them, to decipher them. Thus, the term typography is a pleonasm. It means to trace traces, which is the reason why Gutenberg, by inventing typography, did nothing more than discover what is implicit in the invention of writing. Now, the mentality which was brought about by typography and which expresses itself in typing is grounded in the belief that the traces which the objective world leaves in the subject may be manipulated and then projected back upon the world in an effort to change the world. In other words, that it is possible to describe the world and then use those descriptions to change the world. This belief proved to be a very powerful one in the course of the modern age, and this is basically the essence of the Enlightenment, of Enlightenment thinking. This, what I was saying before, this discovery of the ability to manipulate models and then project these models back into the world and change the world through this projection. This belief proved to be a very powerful one in the course of the modern age, and in fact, the changes brought about in the world by science and technology have changed human existence beyond recognition. But at present, this belief has become open to two sorts of objections. The one says that what we write down, the types we engrave, are not really traces left by the world, but traces of the way our own thinking functions. That we do not discover the so-called laws of nature, but that we project the rules of our way of thinking into the world and then rediscover them and call them laws of nature. The other objection says that the changes scientific and technical progress has brought about, for instance Auschwitz, the thermonuclear weapons or pollution of our surroundings, are not a proof of the concreteness of our belief, but of its folly. The two objections, the epistemological and ethical one, taken together are about to undermine the modern belief in the premise that underlies typing, that it is possible to typify and then use the types to change the world for the better. They're about to undermine the belief in progress. And this is quite significant because this, what he's pointing to, that it is taken together, are about to undermine the modern belief in the premise that underlies typing, that it is possible to typify, as in that it is possible to abstract a phenomenon and then use that abstraction in order to change the world for the better. They're about to undermine the belief in progress. There is a curious nominalistic flavor to those two objections, to use this medieval term. The epistemological objection seems to say that the types are pure conventions after all, flatus vocis, hot air, and that they show this when typifying, modeling. Thought is applied to the phenomena of the subatomic level. So this is a good example in that when we started creating or discovering the subatomic level and started working with subatomic physics, we project models onto that world. We project these. There's I forgot his name now, but there's a mathematician, a physicist who won a Nobel Prize for modeling, for creating models of subatomic particles, for creating a model of the atom. And so this is what he's saying, is that this is kind of the epitome of this modern thinking, that we can create abstract models from the concrete world, and then use these models projected back into the concrete world in order to change it. But he's saying, like this, it's a kind of this symbiotic relationship is very problematic, because are we really discovering these shapes, or are we projecting these shapes? It's and the ethical objection seems to say that disciplined, scientific, value-free research and the technology based on it will involve us ever more deeply in the devil's dragnet. In fact, this nominalistic climate, which experiences the world as an absurd context, is with us at least ever since Kafka. But there is this difference between the medieval and our own situation. We no longer have that faith which inspired, for instance, Saint Francis. We cannot go back to nominalism, but we can go forward. If indeed typifying is not the manipulation of traces left in us by the objective world, but if it is the manipulation of our own thought structure, and if indeed the world is an absurd, meaningless context, then is it not possible to project deliberately a meaning, or various meanings, upon the world by manipulating types, symbols, right? So this is the reason why he wrote this essay, was to get to this question. So basically, he was working to get to this question, to this phrase, which is really fundamental to understand. When he says, so if indeed the world is an absurd, meaningless context, which was a very big question, especially for the existentialists in the 20th century, because after Nietzsche declared, God is dead, which is important to note that he didn't say God doesn't exist. He said God is dead, which is a different thing. He said what he meant, the consequence of that for much of the 20th century was, okay, so if we lose this source of values, God as a source of values, as a source of morals, then where else do we get these values from? And if the world is indeed this absurd, this world that is completely meaningless and pointless and so on, and everything is random, then what is the meaning of life? And a lot of existentialist thinking is always on the borderline of nihilism, of saying, like, if we don't know what all of this means, then it means it's absolutely meaningless, and there's no point in dealing with it, and this is still very much a big question today. But what Flusser is then suggesting is that then is it not possible to project deliberately a meaning or various meanings upon the world by manipulating types, or by manipulating symbols or abstractions or models or whatever other words we like to give it, which means yes, the challenge is to come to the conclusion that the world is absurd and meaningless, but at the same time not fall into nihilism by realizing that we have a creative, let's say, agency in this process, in that we can deliberately project meaning. We don't need, meaning doesn't have to come from somewhere else. We project meaning. And this, like ethically, this has very, very kind of complex, how to call it, connotations and possible outcomes. Because it means, you know, like if we are projecting meaning, then it goes into the whole sort of several layers and of the question of responsibility and so on and so forth. You know, we are not kind of, first of all, we have to come to the realization that we are not these little individual atoms in the world that just interact with each other a little bit and so on, that we are linked to each other in many different ways and so on. So there's many different levels here in this very, very simple phrase. But, so continuing, if we no longer believe that it is possible to discover something behind the world because there is nothing there to be discovered, can we not project something upon the world? You see? Of course, such a new mentality which no longer tries to discover but attempts to project would have to abandon the distinction between truth and fiction. So this is another implication which is very serious, because if we start saying that we can project meaning into the world, then we can no longer say that what we are trying to do is to discover the truth, or to try to get to this point that we call truth or reality. And therefore, this distinction between truth and fiction breaks down. And this, like, from a moral perspective, it raises many questions that we have to deal with. Having lost faith in science and having lost faith in God long before that, it will have to use, for the concept of truth, in the traditional meaning of that term, I'll reread that again. Having lost faith in science and having lost faith in God long before that, it will have no use for the concept of truth in the traditional meaning of that term. Still, although a distinction between truth and fiction would no longer apply, this does not necessarily mean that any fiction is as good as any other. New criteria for projections of meanings upon a meaningless world would have to be elaborated. Nietzsche's sentence, "Art is better than truth," does not necessarily imply that we have to expect the abandon of all criticism. So this is also a criticism to the notion that if everything is meaningless, then anything goes. Then we don't have to worry about anything, we can do anything. He's saying no, we still have to be critical, we still have to be ethical, we still have to think about these things, these models or these values that we project into the world. It's not a case of anything goes. Now we can make an effort to intuit this new mentality which is emerging from the present crisis of typographical thinking, because this new mentality is already about to manifest itself through various channels, of which the synthetic images produced with computers are good examples. There's a logical progression between from calligraphy, typographic thinking, and what comes now that could be called vectorial thinking. Because with calligraphy, the artist is in complete control of the shape of the letter. He who is the scribe who is creating the letter is creating the shape. Then comes typographic thinking, where the shape of the letters are fixed, and therefore these are kind of fixed values that are being projected. But with vectorial thinking, it is a completely different approach. We have this logical production between calligraphic work, typographic work, and then now vectorial work. And these three ways of thinking and approaching shapes is very different. They're very different. And I think that what he's suggesting in terms of vectorial thinking today hasn't really been realized. because it is what he's talking about in relation to the truth. With typographic thinking, models are still fixed. In the modern age, we're creating models, but they are still fixed. We're manipulating models, but when we put them in the world, they're still fixed. Somebody is in charge of these models, of like imposing these models and so on. The church, the academy, etc., etc. There are authorities that put these models forward. But today, with digital technology, we are the manipulators of models. And actually there aren't really, if we think about it, models that are given, that we really have. And I think that this is one of the kind of the slow kind of realization of our sort of what could be called a current crisis, which is a crisis of models, of values, because we just don't know where, if there are values to be followed. These are all kind of very kind of powerful questions for us today. It's like how do we decide, like for example in terms of value, how do we decide what is right and wrong? I mean, these are different measures. If you look at what is happening politically around the world right now, in Russia, in my country, Brazil, where I come from, it is a fundamental crisis of values, of what could be termed as right or wrong, of what can and cannot be done at a social level, at economic level, many different ways. So I'll just continue a little bit. So those images are computations of meaningless particles, electrons, and their purpose is to produce meaning. They are givers of meaning, in a sense close to what Husserl had in mind in his analysis of the phenomenal world we live in. For this new phenomenological mentality, the abstract and typifying thinking of modern science, as it is articulated in typography, is no longer adequate, and it is to be substituted by a return to the meaningless things like electrons themselves, and then by a deliberate production of fictitious meanings. We can intuit this new mentality because this fictitious world of images without material support, this fictitious world of electromagnetic immaterials, is already now being experienced by us as being the real world, Lebenswelt, the world we live in. Modern scientific thought, brought about by typography and expressing itself typographically, is about to be overcome by postmodern, post-scientific thought, brought about by electromagnetic images and expressing itself, as yet very tentatively, in those images. This transition from one mentality to another will no doubt be at least as slow and difficult as was the transition provoked by the invention of printing. This is the reason why we can do nothing more but try to vaguely intuit what lies in store for our children. But one thing seems to be certain: the worldview which underlies typing, including this text, which is being typed, will not survive the transition. So, if we remember that, what I was saying before, that the transition between calligraphy and typography took 150 years to really settle into specific standards and so on, and to then start really changing things. It's a very long period. So if he's saying that we are going through this transition right now, it's very unlikely that we will see the full results of this transition. I really think that because this is one of the criticisms that he has that is made of him, of his work, is that his thinking is outdated and that what he predicted hasn't happened, but actually he's projecting much further into the future. So if it took that many years for typographic thinking to have an effect, this, what I call vectorial thinking, could take just as many years. I mean, it could take a whole century in order for it to really have the effect that he imagines it may have. So we haven't really seen much of it yet. We've seen some of it, but not a lot of it. And I think that I could stop here, and yeah, I think that's it.